Well, hello everyone. I am Jernay Armand from Team Flip. We are thrilled to welcome you to today's event. Whether you are a student, educator, parent, librarian, historian, or simply someone who is interested in learning more about how to preserve our history, we believe that you will find this session to be both engaging and educational. In this 30-minute session, we will be sharing practical tips and strategies for preserving and sharing the rich legacy of Black history. And we want to pack in as much material as possible so you can take it, use it, and implement it today. So sit back, relax, and let's get started. Okay, so we've broken this event into a two-parter, and we have the privilege of having Dominique Luster and Dr. Kelisha B. Graves here with us today. The first part of our discussion will be around the importance of preserving history and more specifically, Black history. They will share their personal journey and their work with the King Center. This will be the section that we recommend you share with your learners on demand if they are not watching with you right now to learn more on preservation of Black history. For the second part, this is all about us diving deep into the educational activities, resources, and the ways we all can preserve and promote Black history. And these are resources that you can use literally today. Does that sound good to all of you? Perfect. So without further ado, let's meet Dominique Luster and Dr. Kelisha B. Graves. Hello, thank you both so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Hi, thank you so much.
Well, you know what? I would love to just jump right into it. So, could you both provide some background around your work? And let's start with you, Dominique. What led you to become an archivist and researcher?
Well, thank you so much. What's funny is that anyone who meets me today would not be surprised that I became a librarian, historian, and archivist because I was the kid that arranged all my books and I actually arranged all my dolls and all my stuffed animals. And one of my very first jobs was actually cataloging in a library. So I think it was kind of a very natural progression into this space. I think I've just always been destined to be someone who helped organize things and find systems and catalogs to make sense of the world and the information that we have in it.
And I'm sure you have a lot of information that you've touched. And I'm wondering, what's the wildest thing you've ever found?
Oh gosh, you'd actually be surprised at what you can find in an archive because it isn't just papers and records. It can be anything that anyone would like. But some of the wildest things that we found are dolls, books, diaries, keys. Like we find really interesting things all the time.
That's incredible. Now, Kelisha, you're a scholar, educator, author, speaker, and serve as the Chief Research, Education, and Programs Officer at the King Center. So, number one, how do you have time for all of this? And number two, where did your passion start for education?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the real answer is I don't know how I have time for all of it. I probably don't, but no. Honestly, I work with a great team of people who help to support and extend the work. But I'm just a person who's always been invested in the world of history and philosophy and in the world of learning. I often say that my mother was my first classroom. Actually, my parents, in fact, they were my first classroom. I grew up in an environment full of books and full of opportunities for discovery. That's what I get joy out of. I get joy out of discovery. I get joy. I love the feeling that happens when you learn something new. It's like a surprise for me. Uh, so it's interesting because going to school for me was a routine. It was something I had to do in order to get back home so that I could really do what I wanted to do, which was to read my books and, write. I used to write stories as a young person. So I've always been involved in the world of knowing, in the world of learning, in the world of seeking knowledge. But not only that, I wasn't just concerned with absorbing knowledge for myself, but I had this desire to share what I discovered, what I found out, because to me this stuff was cool. Like, whereas some folks look at history and kind of have these preconceived notions about what it is and what it could mean, I loved discovering new things and then sharing that with people. So that's actually how I ended up going into education. I just literally wanted to share all of the great things that I was finding out.
Well, we definitely appreciate you sharing with us today. And I know everyone will experience that joy of learning. Now, I hear you start your classes with a specific question. What might that question be?
Yes, every semester I start out my classes with this question. I ask students, and we use a word cloud generator to do this particular activity. So I asked the students, I said, when you think about historical African descendant people or historical African Americans, what comes to mind? And invariably you get the responses: slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, brutality, a lot of the what we might see as the pathologies that are associated with Blackness. And so we generate this word cloud, and when all of the students have given their responses, I ask a collective question and I say, what's the one word you don't see on the board? And everybody's like, I don't know, we said everything. The one word every semester that's missing is the word thinker. And so for the students, I say, look, this informs me to the fact that fundamentally out your first premise about who you believe African descended people are in the world is not as a thinker. And that's problematic. So in so much of my work, I try to center that this idea of African descended people being thinkers, not just doers, but people who had real thoughts. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. That I'm not just one who is an inanimate object that's moved around or throughout the world, but that I am indeed a person, that I have subjectivity, and that I have impact on the world. So every semester, that's the question that opens up the course. When you think about historical African Americans, what comes to mind?
Wow, that's incredible. And that phrase cogito ergo sum, I remember from high school. I think therefore I
Yeah,
am, right? And
that's
so
right.
we all are thinkers. And so I want to know a little bit more about the King Center. So when did the King Center open and what are you doing for the King Center? So Dr. Kelisha Graves, let's start with you.
Yeah, so the King Center was founded in 1968, shortly after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, and it was founded by Mrs. Coretta Scott King. And Mrs. King was always committed to this idea that nonviolence was something that needed to be, that wasn't just significant for the civil rights movement, but that it needed to be shared throughout the world so that people could adopt it for their personal lives. So today, the King Center exists as a programmatic nonprofit, and we contribute in the areas of research, education, and training. That's the particular unit at the King Center that I oversee. So my specific title is I am the Chief Research, Education, and Programs Officer. And so what that means is that I get to work with a great team of people to design learning journeys for people all over the world. And later on in this program, I'll get to show the audience one of the iterations of that learning, of the learning journeys that we create.
And I hear you actually started with the King Center at age 15.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more
So
about that.
I didn't necessarily start with the King Center when I was 15. I developed an interest in the King legacy at 15. So it was around, gosh, everybody's going to know how old I am once I say this. So in January 2006, it was around the King holiday. Of course, I was out of school and I was at home, and my father was always a connoisseur of talk radio and news programs. He was also someone committed to lifelong learning. And so there was a show he was watching in another room called Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman. And I was in my room doing something else. I remember what I was doing. I was working on a list of classic films that I was going to watch. Again, I've always loved history, so I was literally writing down the Elizabeth Taylor and the Greta Garbo and the Claudette Colbert movies that I was going to watch for the week. And so my dad is like, he called me into the room and he said, I want you to watch this program. I was not interested because it was a King holiday. We're out of school. We do this every year. It just didn't have real meaning for me. So I reluctantly went and watched this particular program with my father. And they kept in the program, they kept showing clips of the Selma to Montgomery March. And in that march, Miss King was there. And I was like, I asked the simple question. I said, if Coretta Scott King was there, why didn't I know about it? One of the things that I tell my students is that it's not always about trying to give the right answer, but asking the right question that will lead you to the next level of insight. So that was my organic research question at 15 years old. And so when the program ended, we had an office in our home, and got on my Windows computer and started literally researching everything I could find about Mrs. King. Now, this was early January 2006. So this was before Mrs. King had passed. She passed on January 30th, 2006. So a couple of weeks before she passed. And I was disappointed because I couldn't really find enough material to suit what I thought to suit the questions that I had. And so went to the local library, checked out all of the books I could find. They only had children's books at the time on Mrs. King. And I actually had a running bill with my local library for years because I would never return the books. So I had a bill with my school library and with my local public library. But children's books, that was the research I had at that time. And so I said at 15 years old, I want to be the first person to do a scholarly work on Coretta Scott King. And that led me to write a letter to Martin Luther King's daughter, Miss Yolanda King, who was the oldest of the King children. I wrote her a letter and I put my phone number at the bottom of the letter. So sent it off to California to her office. And a couple of weeks later, they literally called the number that I put in the letter. And Miss King's assistant actually called the number, and she said, Miss King received Kelisha's letter. She wants to know if you all can be in Atlanta on Saturday. This was on a Wednesday when the call came. And who's going to say no when Martin Luther King Jr.'s daughter calls you to Atlanta? And so we went. And that literally started my kind of lifelong affinity and association with the King legacy.
Wow, what a beautiful story. And I think it sums up, it starts with me, right? So
Right.
Thank you for taking that initiative. So Dominique, when did you start working with the King Center and what do you do with them?
Absolutely. So what's interesting is that while I did just start actually the opportunity of working with the King Center just a few months ago, so my relationship formally with the King Center is I would say a little newer than Dr. Graves'. I think that's fair. Is a little newer, but I was also the person that had an extending library bill. By the way to get around that, Dr. Graves, is to go volunteer at the library, which is how I got my very first job. But fast forward from there to now, the work that I've been able to do with the King Center over the past few months, as we will talk about later in this program, is to help connect the physical parts of history, the archival bits of history, the letters, the photographs, the documents, the videos, connect that into a story that it makes sense, that is larger than any one person, that's larger than any one institution, that's about a movement of people and a movement of a cause forward in a way that makes sense, in a way that is that makes history seem cool, that it is cool, that kind of helps uplift archival documents, old letters, old photographs into contemporary relevance. And that's the work that we've been able to do together over the past few months.
That's incredible. And I believe the archives can help shape our future. So why is history so important? And what does history mean to you both? So Dr. Graves, let's start with you.
Sure. So history is about the continuity of the human story. That's the academic answer, right? The reason why history is important is for me is I just find it fun and exhilarating again to discover so many things that I did not know before. So back to the academic answer. History is about the continuity of the human story, but also it's a laboratory, right? You can't, because of ethics and research methods, protocols, you can't just run scientific experiments on human beings, right? Ethically. But looking at history, you can understand what happens to people, right? And in various places of the world, in different cultures, you can understand what happens to people under certain conditions. So history is a continuity of the human story, but it's also a laboratory. But also history is important because it sets up a tradition. It helps us to know and to understand that we are not alone in this world, that we in fact stand on the shoulders of giants. So continuity of the human story, it's a laboratory, right? And then also understanding that we are not alone.
And so I'm wondering, Dominique, I know the King Center is working to preserve Black history, but in what ways can individuals outside of the academic and museum settings contribute to the preservation of Black history?
Well, I think what's interesting about history is that it's a study, to kind of piggyback off of what Dr. Graves has already said. It's a study, it's a type of study, which means that it is not random. It is not a thing that just happens. It is not some just random chronology of events that just happen to be put in the correct order for a book. It is a position of power. It is the expression of power by any group of individuals that help write that history, which means if history is written, then write it. Right? Like that is the charge here is that anybody, whether you're in the academic space or not, actually the majority of history is the majority of events happen outside of the academic space, and then only within the academic space do we write about it. So the everyday person can write their own history, their own family's history, African American history, by simply participating, actively participating in the history making process, in the story making process, in the human development process, and then write that story down, whether that be in your journals, your diaries, a voice note on your phone. It really actually doesn't actually matter that much, but writing it down. History favors history. Again, the study of it, the study of the human experience favors those who wrote it down, who took the photo, who wrote it in their diary. Dear diary, today was this, right? And then that diary gets passed along. That cookbook gets passed along, that family Bible gets passed along. And so it's not necessarily just that so-and-so was baptized on this day and we wrote that down in the family Bible. It's that that Bible then gets passed along, or that you can take a voice memo on your phone in the living room or the kitchen with your parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, great, I don't know how far, your family tree may go. Write that down, take that voice note, even if you don't know what to do with it just yet, even if you don't necessarily have a particular place to put it or an archive to include it in just yet, having it is always better than not having it.
If I could say this, Shirney, with in tandem with what Dominique just said about history being about making, I love that she said history making. History is not just lived, but it's made in the physical accoutrements of our culture that Dominique talked about. And that's how we know what happened. That's how we even have a concept of something being historical, because someone took the time, the same way that Mrs. King did with Dr. King and the movement, but someone took the time to preserve the story, to not so that there could be a testament to the living. So thank you, Dominique, for talking about and articulating about history as a making process.
Yes, and to go right along with that, how can we ensure that maybe some stories of lesser known figures in Black history are not forgotten? Because I know for many, right now it's Black History Month, and sometimes you may see many of the same names come to the forefront. So, how can we ensure that these stories of lesser known figures in Black history are not forgotten?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, history does not interpret itself. We must indeed ask questions of history. And so that means that we have the responsibility to ensure that our memories are, number one, long enough. A lot of times we talk, particularly with African American history, with sometimes the way it's taught, it begins in slavery, right? But if you start your history in slavery, everything since then looks like progress. So what I mean about our history being long enough, we have to stretch the timeline further than the moment enslaved people touched down on this terra firma called America, right? So we have to ensure that our memory is long enough so that we could go back and reclaim some of those other names. Furthermore, we have to ensure that our history is wide enough. What does that mean? There is a massive pantheon, if you will, if I could call it a pantheon, a massive audience, a massive array of witnesses that we can pull from as it relates to the African American experience. One of the ways that I do that personally, I live in bibliographies. I will read a book and then, skip pages just to go to the index, just to go to the bibliography, because I'm always looking for names. That's when my book on Nannie Helen Burroughs came about in the exact same way. I literally was reading a book on, I believe it was W.E.B. Du Bois, and I saw Nannie Helen Burroughs' name in the footnotes. So I live in footnotes, I live in bibliographies, and that helps me to mine history, if you will, to discover names that may not be mentioned in the main text, right? But whether they're mentioned in the bibliography or in the footnotes, that doesn't mean that they were any less important. So our memory has to be long enough and it has to be wide enough so that we can ask the right questions of history.
Oh, yes. And with that, thank you for opening up about your story and the importance and impact we have on preserving and honoring Black history. Now, we're going to move on to our next section, and we're going to talk about resources that you can use with your learners. Now, Dominique and Kelisha, as experienced archivists and storytellers, would you be willing to share some of the resources the King Center has with our audience today?
Sure, most certainly. So I'm not an archivist, but I am a lifelong learner. Dominique's actually she's the actual archivist. I just like to discover things. So on the screen here, you will see the main website at the King Center. Again, I oversee the research, education, and programmatic areas at the King Center in Atlanta, Georgia. And so if you go to our website, under our What We Do tab, you'll see the buffet, the array of things that we do at the King Center. I want to show briefly our classroom resources page, which is excellent for K-12 educators. At the King Center, we have a department called Students with King, which focuses on our K-12 programming proper. So we have lesson plans here for K through 12, and all of our content aligns with Martin Luther King Jr.'s philosophy and methodology of nonviolence. So students learn about the philosophy of methodology of nonviolence, but they also learn about Martin Luther King Jr., Mrs. Coretta Scott King, and the American Civil Rights Movement. We also have a video library, so we have a virtual tour of the National Historical Park that can be shown in classrooms. We also have a mini documentary series, if you will, called Nonviolent Spotlight Series, where we highlight unsung heroes and sheroes of the civil rights movement. We also highlight family and friends and folks who knew Martin Luther King Jr. and Mrs. Coretta Scott King. We also have a reading corner program, which is our literacy, which is the way that the King Center intends to support literacy development among young people. So we have authors from all around the world come onto our platform and share their children's books. So the reading corner is also a really great resource as well for teachers who are committed to bringing the King legacy into your classroom. Furthermore, we have Nonviolence 365 online. This is our programming for, which is targeted for adult audiences. It's appropriate for I would say from high school range to adult audiences, but Nonviolence 365 online is our training, online self-paced training platform where people can literally learn and absorb the philosophy and methodology of nonviolence. And so we have two versions of the course. We have a masterclass version, which is about 8 hours. So also have a workplace edition, which is 3.5 hours long. And we recently translated the masterclass edition in Spanish, French, Korean, and Mandarin. So the Nonviolence 365 masterclass is a really great platform for people who are interested in learning more.
Thank you so much for sharing those resources online. I know there's also a timeline also
Yes.
available.
Yeah.
So, Dominique, do you want to talk to us a little bit more about the timeline that's available?
Absolutely. I'd be happy to. And so, what's really great about this timeline is that it takes it's this larger breadth and depth. So we go wide and we go deep in this thing. You know, it is the story not only of Mrs. Coretta Scott King, but it's also the story of Coretta Scott. We start with Coretta Scott. Before there was a Coretta Scott King, there was a Coretta Scott. And so we introduce her, we introduce her parents, we show you some videos and clips of her even talking about her own childhood and her journey through university. And we really start with, where does this philosophy of nonviolence come from for her? Not just as this final institution that we do also see in the timeline. You know, it traces it doesn't just start with buildings came out of the ground, right? It starts with a woman who was first a little girl who went to school just like a lot of other kids and learned these things from her parents. And we trace in this timeline all the way through her adulthood, all the way through her marriage with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And eventually, after her marriage with Dr. King, she continues his legacy. She continues speaking up and lifting her own voice through the community, through the civil rights movement. And what we've done as she moves forward to lead the nation in this philosophy of nonviolence, what we've done is connected very specific photographs, very specific audio clips or videos, or all kinds of different types of items that you can dive into, whether that be in 1968 or 1998. There's a lot in there for students, teachers, parents, everybody to kind of find something that gravitates for them. I think.
Wow.
Like it.
I am like blown away with the wealth of these incredible resources for anyone, parents, educators, and all lifelong learners. So, any final thoughts you'd like to share with everyone watching? Dominique, do you want to go first?
Oh, I'd love to. Thank you so much for having me. And I just want to encourage everyone to take down that family story, record that voice memo, whatever it is, and whatever makes sense for you. Be an active member of history making.
Awesome. And Dr. Graves?
Yeah, just to align with what Dominique said, you don't need permission to start now. And remember that it always starts with you. You can begin on the journey to collecting your family history, to documenting your own story now. So thank you as well for having us today.
Well, change makers, remember it starts with you. You have that power to make a change. And thank you for your time and for inspiring all of us, both Dr. Graves and Dominique. And we will see everyone next time.
Bye. Thank you.
Now, that was
Thank
amazing.
you.
And one thing I do want to leave you with is this incredible timeline of the King Center. It's a resource that can show you the importance of preserving Black history. You can start exploring at aka.ms/the King Center timeline. And even though we're wrapping up for today, we have flip events every week. And I am so excited to share that we will be meeting Dr. Bernice A. King on March 8th to celebrate and honor Mrs. Coretta Scott King, the founder of the King Center. Head to aka.ms/flip events to register. Well, that's it for today. I'm your host, Jornay Armand, and on behalf of Flip, the King Center, and our amazing guests, Dr. Kelisha Graves and Dominique Luster, thank you for spending your time with us. We'll see you next time.